The Volkswagen Type 1 or VW Beetle does not need an intro. If you enjoy fun, detailed car content without fluff, consider subscribing and hitting the bell for notifications. The Type 1, later known officially as the Beetle, has some of the darkest, most interesting history for a people mover. Originally designed in 1925 by an 18-year-old named Bernie, it was later refined and brought to life by Ferdinand Porsche to fulfill the needs of Nazi Germany. It went on to become the highest selling vehicle of all time, I guess highest selling platform of all time, with over 21 million units moved. But that's kind of makes more sense when you consider that this thing was in production for technically over 60 years, finishing out its years being sold in Brazil and Mexico, the latter of which built this car up until that point in 2003. I won't bog you down with my thoughts on the aesthetics, but I do want to bring up a couple things. One, the exterior shell did not change all that much in those 65 years. It did have to adapt to conform to some, modern safety regulations, but there really weren't all that many when this ceased production, at least in the US in 1979. This car has obviously some modifications like aftermarket Jeep headlights. Then these bumpers are obviously not stock, as is the paint color. In the 70s, we did get something called the Super Beetle, which had a slightly bigger frunk, and then it also had McPherson struts up front instead of the torsion beam setup, which my car has. While they look similar, many panels are not interchangeable due to the slight addition in length. For 73, Super Beetles got an even more distinct look with a curved windshield. All Supes mounted the spare tire flat to help maximize frunkiness. And if you want to get a VW for yourself, may I recommend Royal on the Eastside in Bloomington, Indiana, the friendly dealership that let me take out this old Beetle. They also sell new Subarus, VWs, and Audis without a markup. Check them out. When it comes to engines, you had a 1.1 liter flat or boxer 4 actually in 1939, I believe. That engine made 25 horsepower and was actually the same engine in the first VW bus. This was hooked up to a 4-speed non-synchronized manual transmission, later of which, like my car here, has a fully synchronized unit. This is actually a surprisingly good little gearbox. You had a 1.2 liter, then a 1.3 liter, and I believe a 1.5 liter as well, but my car has the 1.6. So here it's going to make supposedly 57 horsepower and about 82 pound-feet of torque. This thing is, of course, air-cooled. So that means you don't have a radiator, there are less parts back there, and that's why the engine can fit in such a small compartment. It also means for a unique engine design. So the cylinders, they're not really part of like one big block. In fact, they come off individually and they have ribs and fins surrounding them to help keep the engine cool through air that is blown by a belt-driven fan on top of the engine. It's beautifully simple. And this car also relies more on the oil cooler as well. If you want a Beetle that stays breezy under stress, find a 1971 or on with the Doghouse oil cooler, which substantially improved cooling at the cost of clogging a little easier. I want to talk the transmission before we do a little 0 to 60. This was, again, a 4-speed manual transmission. You could actually opt in later years, or I think around the 60s is when they started offering it, something called an auto stick, or just the stick shift, which is a little misleading, but it did not have a clutch. It was an automatic, and you would kind of just manually select the gears on it. It does not seem like it was something that was too popular, and a lot of people would swap the manuals into those. This manual transmission uses the standard 4-speed pattern from VW, push down and over to the left for reverse. First is basically just straightforward, and honestly, the gear lever here feels a lot better than it did in the VW bus I drove a couple of years ago. That had, I think it was just down to the rods or whatever was connecting it to the transmission. It was much longer, so it just felt more vague when you're trying to shift. But this one is more pleasant to operate. It's not the most precise feeling thing out there, but it has a nice little engagement into each gear. And the clutch too, even with the floor hinge mount there, it's actually pretty easy to use. A little like sticky, but this is probably more so coming down to 50 years of variable here. For this test, I'm gonna try to be a little bit easy on it for obvious reasons, and we are definitely gonna start going downhill towards the end here, so it's not gonna be the most accurate. I'm just more so interested in if we can get to 60, at least in a reasonable manner. No tack. All right, we're starting to go downhill. 60. 20.9 seconds. You know, it's actually geared aggressive enough to make this pretty reasonable. I mean, down low there, it felt like, I just hopped out of a Honda HR-V and it didn't feel all that much slower than that. In fact, it was actually quicker to 20 miles per hour than the HR-V. That gearing, torque, and ultra lightweight make this powertrain shockingly potent for city travel. It's still double check your eyesight slow, but I actually find this fun around town. While on the topic of common problems, popping out of reverse is typical, something my tester also suffered from. And I'm having difficulty figuring out if this is just how they were, but the return spring for the shifter in my car doesn't really work, causing my monkey brain to do this a few times. It's also... Oh, I was like, why did third become neutral? Obviously, speed is not what you're going for with something like this, but it does feel a lot more spry than the VW bus, which makes perfect sense. When it comes to passing power, if you're at lower speeds, this is fine. If you're at higher speeds, you need to rethink your request. As above speeds of 35 miles per hour, the car can no longer rely on its aggressive gearing. The funny thing is this is the fast one. And if you were wondering, in order to open the trunk, you can't just press this button here. You actually have to pop it, and the release is in the glove compartment. Early models actually didn't even have a fuel filler door. You actually just opened up the front and filled it directly here. I think they called those like the camelbacks. At least you do have a spare tire here to protect your gas tank. For cars like mine, the fuel door release is operated by a cable below the glove box, which was interestingly painted over here. One thing that's kind of fascinating about the old Beetle is its wheelbase. They actually reused this platform and wheelbase for the VW Type 2, or the microbus, which is obviously a much larger vehicle that can seat 7 people comfortably with cargo as well. The difference here is that you're just not sitting over the front wheels. Additionally, this thing obviously does not have AC, so the best form of ventilation come from these smoker windows. You had steel wheels here. Most of them were either 14s or 15s like my car here. Now, if you're wondering about airflow to the engine, well, it comes in the form of these. The engine bays do get very hot, and with pretty much all of the designs, they had the fuel filter, which was usually just a cheap plastic one, placed right over the distributor, so if it cracked and started leaking gasoline, it wasn't in exactly an ideal place. Some people actually move the fuel filters, somewhere in between the gas tank up front and the fuel pump, or others will just use a metal fuel filter. The steering is borderline scary, especially when you get it up to higher speeds. But I just can't help but smile when I'm driving this. It's such a satisfying experience rolling through the gears in the VW Beetle, and I would never consider this for highway travel. This is just... no. In 1975, maybe earlier depending on location, the Super Beetle got rack and pinion steering, which should improve high-speed stability. You can also buy a quicker steering box that will take out some of the slop. Surprisingly, my torsion setup does use the more sophisticated ball joints, but pre-66 cars have a more tough kingpin beam at the end. Looking around, I mean, it looks like, a car from the 40s. It's very nostalgic, but just also usable and practical. The VW Beetle is packaged extremely well. So I am 6'3", and I have plenty of headroom. I mean, like an obscene amount of headroom. And it's just enough space for my knees and legs. Yeah, the driving position isn't exactly ideal. And my car here has spring seats, which should be an interesting addition to bumpy corners. But yeah, you could have a variety of driver sizes and this would work. There was never really all that much going on with the interior, especially in the early models. Like if you wanted to adjust your seats in the first cars, you literally had to like unscrew them. Here I have some adjustability, and I have things like windshield wipers. And the few controls here are nice and satisfying. The previous owner here did install an aftermarket radio, as you would expect. Obviously no AC. Heater switches, which are next to the transmission, and then you actually control it with these little levers. One lever controls the direction, the other controls the flow. In earlier cars, you turned a single dial like a spigot. The heat comes from the exhaust. No, not the fumes. Although it is common for these things to smell like fuel, which is reassuring. This is channeled into the cabin and released at your feet or the windshield. It is also infamously inadequate at heating in cold climates. Another little cool quirk is the visors themselves. So when they fold down, the car is so tiny that the visors actually cover the whole width of the roof. So in order to accommodate for the mirror, they have shaped them around it, which is just kind of interesting. Another thing, these windshield wipers are like 9 inches long at the most, maybe 10, and they're just so hilarious to watch. It kind of reminds me of the Toyota FJ Cruiser, which had a very short windshield and actually had 3 of these wipers. Your speedometer has a fuel gauge placed in the middle there. The early cars actually didn't even have a fuel gauge. You just had a switch down here to change into your reserve tank in case you miscalculated. You have this giant wheel here because obviously you don't have power steering. In fact, it only looks like there's one thing hooked up to the accessory belt back there, and that's the fan. The steering wheel does though get in the way, you know, if I'm like trying to shift into second. And the pedals too. One, there's like no heel toe downshifting in this thing. At least, yeah, no, there's zero chance I'm able to do it. But two, they are all floor hinged, including the clutch. I mean, you get used to it pretty quick, but it's just a weird sensation. The windshield is also closer to my face than a cat in the morning. It's why my camera angle was very personal for this one. This was technically a 5-seater when it released, but really, at best, you're fitting 3 children in the back there, and probably European ones at that. Later, this was just marked a 4-seater. The doors also open a nice 90 degrees. If you kind of manhandle the front seat occupant there, you can fit in the back seat. Again, I am 6'3". This would not be comfortable. The seat is definitely just resting on my knee. I'm actually just grazing the roof line here. You could fit 2 adults back here in a pinch, especially if they were shorter. Plus, I can still vent out the rear windows, and you get little straps here. The seats are still springy. I'm not sure if they were always springy. VW fanatics, let me know if they used a different type of seat at any point in the duration. You have to remember, this car, you know, existed for over 60 years. We make it 5 years and we do a full redesign. They did make a lot of tweaks to the interior over the years. So I want to know from any VW Beetle owners out there, what are some quirks that yours has that my 1970 doesn't? Now, you do actually have 2 forms of trunks in the Beetle. One is the frunk, which I am not going to try to put myself into. That seems very treacherous. I usually would do that. And then you have a rear shelf, which is big enough to accommodate some of my camera gear here. You can fold down the rear seat too, and you'll have a nice little cargo area here. You're on these nice back roads, cruising around 35, maybe 40 miles per hour. The steering is loose as all hell. The brakes, I mean, you have 4-wheel drum brakes here. Not gonna be too grabby, but I can say it's pretty comfortable. And this might come down to these springy seats, but the suspension itself is, you know, nice and soft. And when it comes to precision, placing the car exactly where you want it to go, you can do it. You just won't do it very confidently. It's less disturbed by bumps mid-corner than I was thinking. Not having power steering here does give me a good idea of what's going on. And when paired up with the easy to operate transmission, I'd describe the Beetle as a transparent, approachable car to drive. At 60 miles per hour, the engine noise is intense, a characteristic of air-cooled motors, especially ones with such an adorable exhaust system. It's loud enough to where I didn't even realize the turning signal makes a clicking noise. Still, I do love the solid thud of the signal stock itself. Noticing some other little things while I'm driving, the door card here is nicely padded so I can rest my knee. Another thing that I really like about this is the visibility. Yeah, the mirrors here are not all that great, but let's get these brakes. The brakes actually work pretty well. I'm getting sidetracked by myself. They do pull the car to the right. They are four-wheel drums. They are hydraulic, but they're not power. If you're remotely used to old cars, I don't think this is really a scary braking scenario. Here, I have zero clue how fast I'm going because the speedometer is indeed broken. And while I would call these durable as a whole, little issues seemed common. The biggest dilemma now is rust. There are numerous areas that are prone to it, and instead of rattling them all off, I've linked a good article. It being a classic car, at this point many things will be on the verge of breaking. Another weird thing I've observed with my tester is the turning circle. These were known to have a poor turning circle, but it actually cuts much harder to the left than it does to the right, which I think is a specific problem with my car, but if there are any bug owners out there with some insight on this, leave a comment. The important part is that these are simple to fix and most parts are common. The nice thing about them being so popular is that prices aren't outrageous. This example is, granted, not perfect, but mechanically and body-wise, it's not really all that bad, at least from my, amateur eyes. If a dealership is trying to sell this one at $12,900, this is something that's pretty attainable for the average car enthusiast who maybe wants to get into classic cars. Obviously, speed is not something that you'll get out the box here, but if you really want to mess with death, people do swap in like Subaru motors into these all the time. And it really doesn't take a whole lot of power to give this thing some guts. Overall, I really understand why this thing made it as long as it did. And the interesting thing about it is that demand shot up in the 60s, over 20 years after its debut, and remained strong well into the 70s. In my 23-year-old head, I can only attribute its long-lasting success to, one, the oil crisis there in the end, but two, to the unique approach to the car. Something brutally simple and designed to be solid. It can accommodate drivers of various sizes, has good cargo solutions for its footprint, its rear engine, rear drive layout works for snow, and parts were cheap. But nothing remotely close to the Type 1 will or really should ever exist again. We may see vehicles similar in principle make it to life, as I do think that there are a ton of people out there who would appreciate a back-to-basics, fun, tiny, versatile car. But it'll be electric and full of pesky safety equipment, which are not bad things. In fact, an electric Beetle would be likely much more reliable and more spirited with little moving parts. This is slow with ponderous handling and the safety of a county fair roller coaster. But such a big part of the experience here is not measurable. The raw sound and feel of the air-cooled Boxer, the open cabin, the crunchy gearbox, the straightforward aspect to everything, including engine work and the extremely analog controls. Most of these things will and probably should stay in the past. That said, if you get the chance to own one and you're okay with a few fumes and pokey acceleration, I wouldn't let the opportunity pass. As we progress, I think these are the kinds of flawed cars that we'll miss the most. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like to help me catch the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe and hit the bell for more. Thank you to all my loyal patrons. I'll catch you in the next one.